I used to get home soaked to the bone after 8 hours spent tying banana trees together, or with pain searing across my back from hunching over sorting fruit all day. And my dad would say, well, that's another day done, another 50 years to go. So I didn't feel like I had much to look forward to. And I mean, like, it was the work, it was essential work. It was, it was, we were feeding the country in some way, so it was noble work, maybe. But the thing is, I couldn't see it as a pathway forward for a life. And I think that's the interesting thing, because we always hear this notion or this idea that we're only limited by our imaginations. But I mean, I'd been writing since I was 10. So like, you imagine situations other than your own, you imagine worlds other than your own. But the thing is, where you're limited not by your imagination, you're limited by your realities. So the people I'd gone to school with had gone on, they'd moved to the cities, they had moved on to university. And I had, after I finished school, I'd moved down here to Townsville, but I couldn't make it work. So yes, I'd gone back, and so it felt like I was becoming stuck in that cycle. And so yeah, like, there was inspiration around me. Working in that place, I was surrounded by people backpackers, so people who traveled the world. So there was inspiration around, but I guess for me, my reality was one of depression and the absence of aspiration. But even within that, you've got quotes about hope. You've got things like hope springs eternal, or hope is what we fight with when we have nothing else left. And so I guess there was always some kind of hope. And for me, I pinned my hopes on something that I guess it's not really significant, but it was implausible for me, because when we were growing up, we would go to Cairns for our school holidays, every school holidays, to stay with my grandparents. But other than that, we didn't go anywhere. There was only one occasion when I was 4 or 5, we travelled down to Mangalala, which is in the middle of nowhere. And I didn't remember it anyway. So there wasn't this idea of escape. But that's what I pinned my hopes on. And so that's what I did. I worked for 9 months, and I bought a car, and I hit the road. And so I came down to Townsville, stayed with my sister for a few nights, and then moved on. The first night, I pulled up in a park. Can't remember where it was. It wasn't far away. Might have been Home Hill, not sure. I barely left my car that night. I cooked in my car. I slept in my car. And I don't, like, anyone who knows me, that's probably not going to be surprising. It was a very timid, halting start, and it wasn't what I was hoping for. But I went on, and the second night I was at a mountainside campsite, and it was a perfect night. Like, the weather, you couldn't hope for better. Campfire, the sounds of nature, the breeze through the trees, birds, all of that. And I remember laying in my tent that night, staring up through the flap of the stars and just feeling this really powerful sense of peace and liberation, a sense of rightness. For the first time in a long time, I felt light. And so I continued traveling down the East Coast. I met some amazing people, spent days just going where I wanted, seeing what I wanted, meeting amazing people everywhere I stopped. But it wasn't all good times. When I was in Hervey Bay, I was walking along the beach and a bunch of drunken louts didn't like the look of me, so yeah, I got a few punches to the head. And after 3 weeks in Toowoomba, I shouldn't have been driving. I was too tired, hadn't slept well that night. I ran a red light and hit another vehicle. I wasn't insured either. So, yes, I didn't have much money at the time, so I had barely enough money to get my car back into working order and limp my way home. So that was the end of that. So I've just told you a complete story, or so it seems, because one of the things you learn about storytelling is that one of the keys to a good story is that you should start as close to the end as you possibly can. And I think that speaks to a bigger truth about storytelling, which is that beginnings and endings don't really exist. They're just knots in a tapestry that we tell about our lives and about the universe. So, but I chose to tell this as a beginning because even though it's a whole story, it's also a beginning. Because, you know, after I had worked for 3 more years and paid down my debt and bought a new car, I did it again. That time it didn't end so badly. But the peace that I found on that second trip was one of the things that led me to university, which is one of the things that led me to England, which is one of the things that led me to another road trip around Europe, which was a disaster because that was in the middle of winter. And yeah, let's not go there. And I think that's the thing with when it comes back to beginnings, it's easy to see things as a beginning, to see a new endeavor as a beginning rather than just a continuation. But beginnings, I think, are a bit more than just, you know, you start a new job or you take another holiday or whatever. They're moments when you have to set aside any fear you have, whether that's fear of doing something new or fear of the unknown, because when you take that step, it takes on a life of its own, and it'll take you places you don't expect.